Picture this, a limestone palace rising above the Hudson River like a mirage, 79 rooms of marble and mahogany glittering against the autumn foliage, its terraced gardens cascading toward the water where Livingston Manor had stood for over a century, and inside, beneath crystal chandeliers that cost more than a worker's lifetime wages, 24 servants moving soundlessly through corridors designed to erase their very existence. This is the Mills mansion at Stottsburg, and what dark truths about American power, California gold soaked in blood, political ambition cloaked in respectability, and the invisible human cost of Gilded Age grandeur would these walls reveal if they could speak? What bargains were struck in its drawing rooms, what fortunes built on Western mining camps and Eastern banking scandals funded its construction, and what price, paid not by the Millses themselves but by countless others whose names we will never know, was extracted to maintain this performance of permanence. The story begins not on the Hudson but in the chaotic, violent goldfields of California in 1848, where a 23-year-old man named Darius Ogden Mills arrived from New York with almost nothing, tried his hand at mining like thousands of others, quickly realized that the real fortune wasn't in digging gold but in controlling the men who did, and pivoted to what would become his empire. Not extracting ore himself but financing the extraction, not risking his own life in the mines but lending money at rates that could crush a man, founding the Bank of California in Sacramento and then moving it to San Francisco, where he partnered with the flamboyant William Chapman Ralston, a partnership that would make both men spectacularly wealthy and one of them spectacularly dead. Mills made his first millions not just from the California gold rush but from the Comstock lode in Nevada, that almost incomprehensible vein of silver discovered in 1859 that would produce nearly $400 million worth of ore over the next 2 decades, and Mills was there at the beginning, financing mining operations, collecting interest, watching his wealth multiply while miners worked in 100-degree heat thousands of feet underground, their lungs filling with silica dust. Their bodies broken by cave-ins and equipment failures, their lives measured not in years but in how long they could withstand conditions that would eventually kill most of them. This was the foundation, the bedrock blood money upon which the Mills fortune was built, money that seemed clean when it arrived in New York but carried with it the weight of every crushed body, every widow left destitute, every child who grew up without a father because Darius Ogden Mills needed to turn a profit. And Mills was shrewd, careful, the kind of banker who knew when to pull back, who sensed when his partner Ralston was overextending himself building the Palace Hotel in San Francisco, spending money like there was no tomorrow, and Mills quietly liquidated much of his holdings in the Bank of California, stepped down as president, and watched from a safe distance as Ralston's financial house of cards collapsed in August 1875, the bank closing its doors, Ralston forced to resign, and the next day his body was pulled from San Francisco Bay in what was officially called an accidental drowning but everyone knew was suicide, and Mills walked away unscathed, his fortune intact, his reputation for prudence enhanced. Never mind that the bank's collapse ruined thousands of depositors, never mind that Ralston's death was directly connected to the financial schemes Mills had participated in, had benefited from, had enabled even as he positioned himself to survive the inevitable crash. This is how great American fortunes are made, not through honest labor but through knowing precisely when to extract yourself from the carnage you helped create. The Bank of California scandal revealed everything about how Western wealth operated. Mines that produced silver worth millions relied on workers who earned $3 a day if they were lucky, who descended into shafts that could collapse at any moment, who breathed air so thick with dust that they coughed up blood within months, who worked by candlelight in temperatures that soared above 100 degrees, who knew that a single mistake, a single moment of inattention, could mean being buried alive or crushed by falling rock or blown apart by misfired dynamite, and the owners, the financiers, the men like Darius Ogden Mills who provided the capital, never saw these conditions, never descended into those hellish depths, never heard the screams when timber supports gave way or when toxic gases suddenly filled a tunnel, never attended the funerals of men who died so that silver could flow from Nevada to San Francisco to the counting houses where it was transformed into abstract wealth, into numbers and ledgers, into capital that could be invested in railroads and real estate and eventually in Eastern mansions where the connection Between the luxury and the suffering that produced it was so thoroughly obscured that the wealthy could genuinely believe they had earned their fortunes through superior intelligence and character rather than through systematic exploitation of men who had no choice but to risk their lives for wages that kept them perpetually in debt to company stores. By the 1870s, Darius Ogden Mills was one of the wealthiest men in America, with mansions in San Francisco and Millbrae on the peninsula, with investments in railroads and hotels and banks, with enough money to start thinking about legacy, about how his family would be remembered, and like so many of these Western fortunes built on gold and silver and blood, the money flowed east, back to New York, back to respectability, back to where old families with old names could confer the one thing money alone couldn't buy, acceptance. His son, Ogden Mills, born in 1856 into wealth his father had clawed from the California goldfields, was raised as a gentleman, educated in the finest schools, groomed to be something his father could never quite be, a member of the Eastern establishment, someone who belonged not through money alone but through marriage and manners and a kind of effortless superiority that only comes from never having questioned your place in the world. When Ogden Mills married Ruth Livingston in 1882, the machinery of social transformation that his father had dreamed of finally began to turn, because Ruth wasn't just wealthy, she was pedigreed, her family line stretching back to 1686 when Robert Livingston the Elder, a Scottish immigrant who had arrived in the Dutch colony with very little, managed through a combination of political shrewdness and strategic marriage into Dutch colonial society to secure a royal land grant of 160,000 acres along the Hudson River, more land than Rhode Island, a domain so vast it functioned as its own feudal kingdom, with tenants who paid rent to the Livingston lords for generations, with manor houses overlooking the river, with a genealogy that included governors and Revolutionary War heroes and diplomats and everyone who mattered in New York's Dutch patroon aristocracy. The Livingstons were American royalty, or as close as a republic could produce, and when Ruth Livingston, great-granddaughter of Morgan Lewis who had been the third governor of New York State and who had built the original house at Stottsburg in 1832, married Ogden Mills, she brought with her not just her family's estate but something far more valuable, legitimacy, the kind of social capital that Western mining money desperately needed, the ability to walk into rooms where new money was still suspect, where California gold dust on your shoes marked you as an outsider no matter how many millions you had, where the Astors and Vanderbilts might accept you if you were rich enough but would never quite forget that your grandfather had been in trade or, heaven forbid, had actually worked with his hands. And Ruth was ambitious, energetic, determined to secure her place. Not just in Hudson Valley society but in the highest echelons of the entire American aristocracy, and that meant houses, the right houses, plural, in the right locations, a townhouse in Manhattan at the right address where she could entertain during the social season, a cottage in Newport where she could compete with the Vanderbilts and Astors during the summer months when all of fashionable society decamped to that rocky Rhode Island shore, an apartment in Paris for European legitimacy and access to the art and antiques that would fill her American houses, and of course the crown jewel, the Stottsburg estate itself, which Ruth inherited from her mother in 1890. The house she inherited was substantial but old-fashioned, a 25-room Greek Revival structure built by her great-grandparents after the original house burned down in 1832, a solid, respectable house that had served the family well for more than half a century but that was hopelessly inadequate for the kind of entertaining Ruth Mills had in mind, not for the scale of performance required to prove that Western money married to Eastern lineage could produce something truly spectacular, not for the statement she needed to make to ensure that no one would ever question whether the Mills family belonged at the very pinnacle of American society. And so in 1895, she commissioned the most prestigious architectural firm in America, McKim, Mead & White, the trinity of Beaux-Arts brilliance whose other clients included Columbia University, the Boston Public Library, the University of Virginia, Pennsylvania Station in New York, and robber barons up and down Fifth Avenue who needed their wealth transformed into architecture that proclaimed their cultural sophistication, to transform her childhood home into something that would announce the Mills family's arrival at the summit of Gilded Age society. Stanford White himself, the genius and libertine who would later be murdered on the rooftop of Madison Square Garden in 1906 by Harry Thaw in one of the era's most sensational scandals involving White's affair with Thaw's wife, the showgirl Evelyn Nesbit, took charge of the Stottsburg project, bringing to it the full force of his considerable talents and his understanding of what architecture could do beyond mere shelter, how it could perform, how it could intimidate, how it could transform Western mining money into something that looked like centuries of accumulated culture and taste. What White created was nothing short of architectural theater. The old Greek revival core was completely enveloped and transformed, like a chrysalis that emerges as something entirely different, expanded from 25 rooms to 79, with 14 bathrooms. An almost unimaginable luxury in 1896 when most Americans still used outhouses, and a weekly bath in a shared tub was standard even for the comfortable middle class, with a facade of Indiana limestone rising 65 feet tall. With massive bay windows overlooking the Hudson River and the Catskill Mountains beyond, with terraces and balustrades and a composition that managed to look simultaneously French and Italian and unmistakably, aggressively grand, that announced from a mile away that whoever lived here possessed not just wealth but taste, not just money but culture, not just power but the right to exercise it. Inside, White deployed every trick in the Beaux-Arts playbook that he had learned studying in Europe and perfected in dozens of commissions for America's wealthiest families: an entrance hall paneled in Circassian walnut, that rare, swirling grained wood from the Caucasus that cost a fortune to import and even more to properly install, with a grand staircase that rose through the center of the house like a theatrical set piece designed to allow women in evening gowns to make entrances that would stop conversation, drawing rooms with frescoed ceilings executed by European craftsmen and marble mantelpieces carved in Italy and imported piece by piece, their weight so enormous that special reinforcement had to be built into the house's structure. A dining room 42 feet long that could seat 40 guests under chandeliers that required a servant on a ladder to individually light and extinguish each crystal-hung candle, the table itself capable of extension to accommodate dozens of courses served on china that bore the family monogram, each place setting representing more wealth than a factory worker would see in a year. A library with floor-to-ceiling bookcases filled with leather-bound volumes, many purchased by the yard from European dealers who specialized in selling culture to Americans who needed their libraries to look well-read even if the books themselves were never opened, although Ruth Mills was in fact better educated than many of her peers and may actually have read some of them. Bedroom suites for the family with adjoining boudoirs and dressing rooms and private bathrooms with fixtures, clawfoot tubs, marble sinks, flush toilets with oak seats and brass hardware that were themselves small fortunes, that represented technology and luxury that 99% of Americans would never experience, that turned the simple biological necessities of bathing and elimination into opportunities to display wealth, and of course the hidden machinery, the architectural sleight of hand that made the whole performance possible. Servant staircases that allowed the staff to move between floors without ever being seen by guests, back corridors and service passages. And a whole parallel universe of narrow, undecorated hallways painted in plain white or beige, where the people who made this luxury possible lived their lives in shadow, moving through the same house but inhabiting a completely different world, a world where beauty and comfort didn't matter, where efficiency and invisibility were the only values, where your entire purpose was to facilitate the family's life while never imposing your own existence upon their awareness. The cost of this transformation was never publicly disclosed, the truly wealthy never discuss such vulgar details, and to ask would be to mark yourself as someone who doesn't understand how these things work, but estimates based on similar projects and the scale of work suggest it ran well over $1 million, perhaps as much as $2 million, which in 1896 represented more money than most Americans would earn in 100 lifetimes, more money than entire towns saw in a year, enough to build 1,000 modest houses or fund a public library system or endow a hospital, and all of it spent to create a house that the Mills family would occupy for perhaps 8 or 10 weeks annually, during the autumn season when the Hudson Valley foliage turned spectacular shades of red and gold and the weather was perfect for house parties and hunting and the elaborate social rituals that justified the whole enormous expense. Because the house was never meant to be just a residence in any normal sense, it was a machine for social performance, a stage set where Ruth Mills could demonstrate that her money and taste were equal to anyone's, where she could host weekend parties that drew politicians and socialites and minor European nobility who were always willing to cross the Atlantic if American millionaires were willing to pay their passage and treat them like the aristocrats they claimed to be, where she could serve 7-course dinners prepared by a French chef in a kitchen equipped with the latest technology, where guests could play golf on the estate's private course and tennis on the clay courts and ride horses from the stable along trails through the property's hundreds of acres during the day, and then dress in their finest for evenings of conversation and music and card games and carefully orchestrated networking, where deals could be made and alliances formed and status confirmed, all while servants in livery moved soundlessly through the rooms, materializing when needed with fresh drinks or clean ashtrays and vanishing when not, their presence essential but their visibility an embarrassment. Their comfort irrelevant, their very humanity erased by a system that required them to be machines, extensions of the house itself rather than people with desires and dreams and exhaustion that accumulated over 17-hour days, 6.5 days a week. Every week of every season the family was in residence, for wages that kept them alive but dependent, that bound them to service because what other options existed for a housemaid or a footman or a laundress in Gilded Age America where factory work was dangerous and farm work was backbreaking and domestic service was considered one of the better options available to working-class men and women, which tells you everything about how limited and terrible those options were. The servant quarters at Stottsburg tell their own dark story. Small rooms tucked into the attic and basement levels, minimally furnished with iron bedsteads and plain bureaus, cold in winter despite the house's expensive heating system because heat rises and the servants' rooms were designed not for comfort but for maximum utilization of otherwise wasted space, stifling in summer when the temperature under the roof could reach 90 or 100 degrees and there was no relief because opening windows meant letting in noise that might disturb the family, accessible only by those narrow back staircases that ensured the two worlds, the world of the family and the world of the staff, never truly intersected except in moments of service, when a butler would appear with a silver tray or a lady's maid would help Ruth Mills dress for dinner, the elaborate process taking an hour or more as corsets were laced and hair was arranged and jewels were selected and everything had to be perfect. Because Ruth Mills could not appear before her guests looking anything less than impeccable, or a footman would stand behind chairs in the dining room, present but invisible, a ghost in livery whose job was to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to refill wine glasses and remove plates and serve courses with choreographed precision that made the whole elaborate meal appear effortless when in fact it represented hours of preparation and split-second timing and physical labor that left the servants exhausted by the time the family and guests finally retired for the evening, except that the servants' day didn't end then because the dining room had to be cleared and the dishes washed and the furniture returned to its proper position and the fires banked and 1,000 other small tasks completed before they could finally collapse into their narrow beds for a few hours of sleep before rising before dawn to begin again. 24 domestic servants were required to run Stottsburg when the family was in residence, each with specific duties and a specific place in the rigid hierarchy that governed life below stairs. A butler who managed the male staff and oversaw all formal service, who was addressed as Mr. by everyone including the family, who had his own small office where he managed the wine cellar and the silver and the endless details of running a great house, who had the power to hire and fire the male servants under his command, who received a salary considerably higher than the footman or useful man but who also bore the responsibility for everything that happened in his domain and who could be dismissed if the family was displeased, who understood that his relatively privileged position depended entirely on the continued satisfaction of his employers and that he could never, ever forget that gap between his status and theirs, a housekeeper who commanded the female staff with military precision, addressed as Mrs., regardless of marital status because Mrs. conferred the authority necessary to manage women who were often young and inexperienced, who had her own sitting room and bedroom, who managed the linen closets and cleaning schedules and the moral conduct of the female servants with an iron hand because any scandal, any suggestion of impropriety, would reflect on her and could cost her her position, who had worked her way up through the ranks from kitchen maid or chambermaid over decades, who knew every corner of the house and every trick of household management, who was paid well by the standards of domestic service but who also knew she would never have enough to retire in comfort, who would work until her health gave out or the family no longer needed her, footmen who served at table and attended to guests, young men in their 20s and 30s who were chosen as much for their height and appearance as their abilities, who wore elaborate livery that cost more than their annual wages, who stood for hours in uncomfortable positions, who carried heavy trays and moved furniture and did whatever physical labor the butler assigned, who were paid better than farm laborers but whose work was considered degrading by men who prized their independence, who might hope to advance to the position of butler themselves someday or who might leave service for other work if they could find it. Who knew that their youth and strength were their only assets and that age would eventually make them unsuitable for positions that required physical vigor and good appearance. A lady's maid who belonged personally to Ruth Mills and accompanied her everywhere, to New York, to Newport, to Paris, who had skills in hairdressing and dressmaking and care of fine fabrics, who helped her mistress dress and undress multiple times each day, who kept her clothes in perfect condition and her jewels organized and her secrets, because a lady's maid knew everything about her employer's body and habits and private life, who was paid more than other female servants and had higher status but who also had no life of her own because she had to be available whenever her mistress needed her, day or night, who could never marry because a lady's maid had to be completely devoted to her employer, who would eventually be pensioned off when age or illness made her services no longer satisfactory, if she was lucky, or dismissed without much compensation if she wasn't, chambermaids who cleaned the endless rooms and made beds and emptied chamber pots and scrubbed floors and dusted furniture and changed linens and kept everything spotlessly clean, young women often recruited from local farms or from immigrant families, who worked from 6 in the morning until 9 or 10 at night with only brief breaks for meals eaten in the servants' hall, who were paid the lowest wages in the household, who were constantly under the supervision of the housekeeper and could be punished for the smallest infraction, who understood that they were completely replaceable and that any complaint might lead to immediate dismissal, who hoped perhaps to advance to the position of lady's maid or housekeeper themselves if they were very skilled and very lucky but who more likely would marry someone from a similar class background and leave service to raise children in poverty not much different from what they'd known as servants, or who would work in service until their health broke and they could no longer manage the physical demands and would be let go to face an old age of desperate poverty, laundresses who washed mountains of linens and clothing by hand in basement facilities that were hot and damp and smelled of lye and bleach, who stood for 10 or 12 hours at a time at washtubs, who scrubbed and wrung and hung and ironed, whose hands were permanently reddened and cracked from the harsh soaps, who were kept separate from the other servants because laundry work was considered the lowest form of domestic labor, who were paid even less than chambermaids, who had virtually no hope of advancement because laundry skills didn't translate to other positions, who simply endured until their bodies gave out, a chef and kitchen staff who produced elaborate meals requiring hours of preparation, who worked in the largest space in the servants' domain, a vast kitchen equipped with the latest stoves and iceboxes and copper pots that cost small fortunes, who faced intense pressure to produce perfection because the success of Ruth Mills's entertainments depended on the quality of the food, who managed complex logistics to ensure that multiple courses arrived at the dining room at the proper temperature and in proper sequence, who created menus that showcased expensive ingredients and fashionable French techniques, who ruled the kitchen with absolute authority but who were themselves subject to dismissal if the family tired of their style or if a single meal failed to meet expectations, coachmen and later chauffeurs who maintained the horses and then the automobiles, who lived above the carriage house and stable, who had separate accommodations from the house servants and formed their own hierarchy, who were responsible for getting the family wherever they needed to go in weather fair or foul, who understood that mechanical breakdowns or accidents would be blamed on them regardless of actual cause, who had some degree of independence because their work took them away from the immediate supervision of butler or housekeeper but who also faced the dangers of working with large animals and then with early automobiles that were temperamental and sometimes dangerous, a night watchman who patrolled the grounds after dark, who was responsible for security in an era when great houses were targets for burglary and when fire was a constant threat, who walked the estate in all weather, who was paid little because night work was considered less skilled but who bore enormous responsibility because any theft or fire would be blamed on his negligence, a useful man whose job was to do whatever odd task needed doing, minor repairs, moving furniture, carrying luggage, anything that didn't fit neatly into another servant's defined role, who had perhaps the least secure position because his work was by definition whatever nobody else wanted to do, who could be blamed for any household failure that couldn't be pinned on someone else, who was paid very little but who stayed because even this precarious position was better than unemployment, and more, always more, an army of workers whose names we barely know, whose photographs rarely appear in the historical record because servants were not considered important enough to document unless they had served for decades, whose lives were consumed by making the Mills family comfortable, and who understood with perfect clarity that they existed in a different universe from the people they served, a universe where a servant could be dismissed without notice for the smallest infraction, showing disrespect, being seen in the wrong part of the house at the wrong time, failing to complete tasks to impossible standards, or simply because the family had decided to reduce staff or didn't like your face or wanted to hire someone younger or more attractive. Where pregnancy meant automatic termination because pregnant servants couldn't work as hard and babies were incompatible with the total availability required, where any suggestion of familiarity with the family was grounds for immediate firing because the social distance had to be maintained absolutely, where you lived in your employer's house but had no claim to it, where you handled objects worth more than you would earn in your entire lifetime but could never own anything comparable, where you watched the family eat meals that cost more than your monthly wages. A single dinner party at Stottsburg might cost $500 or more, which represented 6 months' wages for a chambermaid, while you ate plain food in the servants' hall, where every moment of every day reminded you that you were not quite human in the eyes of those you served, not quite worthy of consideration, not quite real. And the Millses were not unusually cruel by the standards of their class. In fact, they were considered good employers, which tells you everything about what good meant in this context. It meant you were paid regularly rather than having wages withheld for arbitrary reasons. It meant you were not beaten or physically abused as was still common in some households. It meant you were not subjected to sexual predation by male family members or guests, or at least not obviously, not in ways that became public scandals. It meant the food provided for servants was adequate in quantity if not quality. It meant that if you kept your place and never complained and sacrificed your youth and health to their comfort, you might eventually be pensioned off with a small sum that would let you die in slightly less desperate poverty than you might otherwise have faced, although this pension was entirely at the family's discretion and could be reduced or eliminated if they decided you hadn't earned it or if they needed to economize. This was the bargain, the unspoken contract that underlay every marble column and gilded mirror at Stottsburg: your invisible labor in exchange for survival, your silence in exchange for employment, your complete subordination in exchange for a roof over your head and food in your stomach, and if you didn't like it, there were 100 others who would take your place because jobs were scarce and alternatives were worse, and at least domestic service kept you fed and clothed even if it destroyed your spirit and wore out your body decades before your time. But the house was beautiful, extravagantly, undeniably beautiful, and when Ruth Mills gave tours to favored guests, showing off the Louis XVI drawing room with its silk wall coverings that had cost a fortune to import from France and that represented hundreds of hours of artisan labor, or the oak-paneled dining room with its massive carved sideboard that had been purchased from a French chateau and shipped across the Atlantic, or the conservatory filled with exotic plants that required constant care from gardeners, or the bedroom suites where every detail had been considered and perfected, where the furniture was museum quality and the fabrics were the finest available and the lighting had been designed to flatter, those guests saw only the surface, only the achievement, only the proof that American money and European taste could create something as magnificent as anything in Newport or Long Island or even Paris itself, and they murmured their admiration, and Ruth felt the satisfaction of knowing she had succeeded, that she had taken her husband's California gold, earned from financing operations that killed miners by the dozen, that enriched bankers while destroying depositors, that built fortunes on other people's desperation, and her own family's Hudson Valley legitimacy, and combined them into something that looked like culture, like refinement, like civilization itself. That she had created a house that would be remembered, that would outlast her, that would prove the Mills family belonged among America's great dynasties. The Mills family's autumns at Stottsburg became legendary among their circle, week after week of house parties where guests would arrive by private railroad car at the nearby Stottsburg station and be transported to the mansion in carriages that were themselves symbols of wealth and taste, where they would be shown to their lavishly appointed guest rooms and then expected to change clothes 4 or 5 times a day depending on the activity, morning dress for breakfast served in the dining room, or in guest rooms depending on preference, riding clothes for an afternoon excursion on horses supplied from the Mills stable, tea gowns for afternoon tea served in the drawing room at 4 o'clock with an array of pastries and sandwiches that required hours of kitchen work to produce, evening dress for dinner that began at 8 and might last 3 hours with multiple courses and carefully selected wines, sometimes costume changes for particular entertainments like tableaux vivants or amateur theatricals that were popular in this era, where the men would discuss business and politics while smoking cigars and drinking brandy after the ladies retired to the drawing room, where decisions about bank mergers and railroad investments and political campaigns were made in casual conversation, where a word from Ogden Mills could make or break a business proposal, where access to this world represented real power, the kind of power that couldn't be voted away or regulated, that persisted regardless of which party controlled the government because the people at these parties were the ones who funded the parties and the candidates and the newspapers and everything else that shaped public opinion, where the women engaged in the delicate warfare of social competition. Comparing jewels and gowns and gossip, establishing hierarchies through subtle comments about who had been invited where, who was coming into fashion or falling out, whose daughter was marrying well or poorly, whose son had done something scandalous, whose family had suffered financial reverses. All of it communicated through a complex code of manners and etiquette that took years to learn and that served to exclude anyone who hadn't been raised in this world, where marriages were arranged not through formal negotiations like European royalty but through carefully orchestrated proximity, weekends at houses like Stottsburg where young people from the right families could meet under proper supervision, and where business deals were concluded and political alliances forged not through written contracts but through handshakes and understandings that were more binding than any legal document because they were enforced by social pressure and the threat of exclusion from this world if you failed to honor your word, because this was the real work of houses like Stottsburg. They were the boardrooms and backrooms of American power, the spaces where the country's direction was determined not through democratic process but through private conversation, where men like Ogden Mills and his peers decided which politicians to back, which legislation to support or oppose, which investments to make, which workers to exploit and which competitors to crush, all while their wives maintained the social machinery that legitimized the whole system, that turned the accumulation of wealth through often brutal means into something that could be celebrated rather than condemned, that made extreme inequality seem natural and even admirable rather than the moral outrage it actually was. And then there was the next generation, Ruth and Ogden's children, who would inherit not just money but the political power that money could buy. Their son, Ogden Livingston Mills, born in 1884 into wealth his grandfather had clawed from California and Nevada, raised in this house and in Manhattan townhouses and Newport cottages, who would attend Harvard and then Harvard Law School, who would marry well, twice. After his first marriage to Margaret Stuyvesant Rutherford ended in divorce in 1919. And then to Dorothy Randolph Fell in 1924, who would enter politics as a Republican representing New York, serving first in the state Senate from 1914 to 1917 and then in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1921 to 1927, who would rise through the ranks of his party to become Undersecretary of the Treasury under Calvin Coolidge in 1927, and then, when Andrew Mellon was kicked upstairs to become ambassador to Britain in 1932, Secretary of the Treasury under Herbert Hoover, right at the moment when the Great Depression was devastating the country, when unemployment had reached 25%, when banks were failing at the rate of dozens per week, when farms were being foreclosed and factories were closing and breadlines stretched around city blocks in every major city, when millions of Americans were facing starvation and homelessness and a complete collapse of the economic system they had believed in. And what did Secretary of the Treasury Ogden Livingston Mills advocate? Did he push for relief programs, for government intervention to help suffering families, for any recognition that perhaps the system that had made his family so wealthy might need fundamental reform? Did he acknowledge that the same economic philosophy that had built Stottsburg, the belief that concentrated wealth would naturally benefit everyone through investment and job creation, had manifestly failed, that the Depression was proof that unregulated capitalism could destroy as effectively as it could create, that people were dying and something had to change? No, he pushed for austerity, for spending cuts that would throw government workers out of jobs, for balanced budgets even as revenues plummeted, for tax increases on ordinary workers to preserve the gold standard that only benefited the wealthy, for all the orthodox economic policies that would deepen and prolong the Depression, that would cause immeasurable additional suffering, that would prove catastrophically wrong, because Ogden Livingston Mills, born in a mansion, educated at the finest schools, never having wanted for anything in his entire life, surrounded always by servants who appeared and disappeared at his convenience, could not or would not understand that the rules that had worked for his family, accumulate capital, live off the interest, let the market sort out the weak, could not work for a nation where millions were starving, and his policies, implemented with the best education and the most earnest Republican convictions and absolutely no understanding of what life was like for ordinary Americans, helped ensure that the Depression lasted longer and cut deeper than it might have, that more families lost their homes and farms, that more children went hungry, that more men lost hope and took their own lives because they couldn't provide for their families, that more women turned to prostitution because they couldn't find legitimate work, that more elderly people died alone and penniless because there was no social safety net, all because men like Mills genuinely believed that suffering was necessary, that the market must be allowed to correct itself, that government relief would create dependency and destroy the moral fiber that made America great, never recognizing or admitting that their own fortunes had been built on government land grants that gave away public resources to private interests, on banking regulations that favored large institutions over small depositors, on labor laws that let employers pay starvation wages and work people to death, on tariff policies that protected American manufacturers while forcing consumers to pay higher prices, on every form of government intervention that benefited capital while opposing any intervention that might help labor, never acknowledging that his grandfather's Bank of California had depended on government-backed gold supplies and federal policies that subsidized Western development and made mining profitable, never seeing the fundamental hypocrisy of a man who grew up in a 79-room mansion attended by 24 servants lecturing the unemployed about the dangers of government handouts and the importance of self-reliance, never understanding that the Depression was caused not by moral failure but by structural flaws in an economic system that concentrated wealth and power in fewer and fewer hands until the whole edifice collapsed under its own weight. Ogden Livingston Mills died suddenly in October 1937, at age 53, of a heart attack at his New York City residence, and newspapers across the country praised his public service and his dedication to conservative economic principles, calling him a statesman and a patriot, lamenting that he had been taken in the fullness of his powers when he might have contributed so much more, noting that he had been considered potential presidential material by Republican leaders who were already looking ahead to 1940 and hoping to find someone who could defeat Franklin Roosevelt and end the New Deal that Mills had opposed so vigorously, and perhaps some people mourned him genuinely, but more significantly, his death marked the beginning of the end for the Mills presence at Stottsburg, because the era that had produced such houses and such fortunes was already dying, killed by the Depression and the New Deal and by changing social attitudes that made it increasingly difficult to justify enormous private wealth while millions suffered, and by tax structures that made it increasingly expensive to maintain these enormous establishments, the income taxes that Mills had opposed and that Roosevelt had increased, the estate taxes that would take huge portions of inherited wealth, all the levies that the wealthy denounced as confiscatory but that were really just modest attempts to redistribute some of the wealth that had been concentrated at the top, and when his sister Gladys Mills Phipps inherited the estate after his death, she recognized what many of her peers could not or would not, that the age of private palaces was over, that holding on to Stottsburg would mean watching it deteriorate as servants became impossible to hire at wages she could afford and as maintenance costs exceeded even the Mills fortune's ability to pay, that the future lay not in private ownership but in public memory, and so in 1938, just 1 year after her brother's death, in what must have been a decision both pragmatic and sentimental, she donated the house and 192 acres to the state of New York as a memorial to her parents, Ruth and Ogden Mills, transforming in a single legal act a private performance of wealth into a public museum of American excess. The donation was presented as philanthropy, an act of generosity that would allow future generations to appreciate the artistic and architectural achievement that Stottsburg represented, and in some sense it was, but it was also an admission of defeat, an acknowledgement that the system that had supported houses like Stottsburg was collapsing, that the labor required to maintain such places was no longer available at prices the wealthy could afford because the New Deal had created alternatives. Social Security meant elderly servants didn't have to work until they dropped dead, unemployment insurance meant workers could survive between jobs without accepting any terms employers offered, labor laws meant workers had some protections and some bargaining power, all of which meant that domestic service was no longer the only option for working-class men and women, that even the Mills fortune, vast as it was, could not sustain this kind of grandeur indefinitely, that the Depression and the New Deal and the social changes they represented meant that American aristocracy, such as it was, could no longer function as it had during the Gilded Age. For years after the 1938 donation, Staatsburg existed in a kind of limbo, open to the public as a historic house but not deeply interpreted, maintained by the state but not really examined, a beautiful shell whose darker meanings remained largely unexplored, because for decades the dominant narrative of houses like this was one of uncomplicated celebration. Look at the craftsmanship. Admire the architecture, marvel at the lifestyle, understand this as the pinnacle of American achievement, as proof that American wealth and European culture could combine to create something genuinely magnificent, and don't ask too many questions about where the money came from or who paid the real price or what this house represented in terms of power and inequality and exploitation, because asking those questions might complicate the story, might make visitors uncomfortable, might suggest that perhaps this beautiful house was also a crime scene, a monument to systematic theft from workers and indigenous peoples and anyone else who stood between the Mills family and their wealth. But then, beginning in the 1990s and accelerating in the 2000s, something changed in how historic houses were interpreted, something shifted in public consciousness and in the discipline of public history that made it possible and then necessary to tell more complete and more honest stories. Historians and curators began digging into the archives, began uncovering servant records that had been preserved but never really examined, began finding account books that showed exactly how much the family spent and what servants were paid, began discovering letters that revealed the tensions and occasional scandals that were hidden from public view, began asking uncomfortable questions about labor conditions and wealth extraction and the human cost of Gilded Age grandeur, began developing tours that told not just the story of the Mills family's taste and accomplishments but also the story of the people who made that lifestyle possible. The servants who worked 17-hour days, the miners who died in California and Nevada to create the Mills fortune, the political and economic systems that allowed such extreme concentration of wealth while workers lived in poverty, began creating an interpretation of Staatsburg that forced visitors to confront the reality that beauty and brutality are not opposites, that exquisite taste can coexist with systemic cruelty, that houses like this are not just monuments to achievement but also monuments to exploitation, not just records of what American wealth could build but also records of what American wealth was willing to destroy to build it, not celebrations of a golden age but evidence of a system that was fundamentally unjust and that should never be romanticized or emulated. Today, when you tour Staatsburg, you see both stories. You see the Circassian walnut paneling and the imported marble, but you also see the cramped servants' quarters. You hear about Ruth Mills's legendary house parties, but you also hear about the 24 staff required to produce that appearance of effortless elegance. You admire the Beaux-Arts architecture, but you also learn about Darius Ogden Mills's bank and the Comstock lode miners and William Ralston's suspicious death in San Francisco Bay. You walk through rooms that drip with luxury, but you're asked to consider what that luxury cost and who paid the price and whether the beauty justifies the brutality that funded it, and that is the real value of preserving places like Staatsburg in the 21st century, not as shrines to a golden age that never was, but as evidence of how our society has always worked, how wealth and power operate, how inequality is not an accident of capitalism but a feature deliberately designed and carefully maintained, how the same dynamics that allowed the Mills family to live in absurd luxury while their servants slept in tiny attic rooms still operate today in different forms with different justifications but with the same results. How the political and economic philosophies that let Darius Mills profit from miners' deaths and let Ogden Livingston Mills prescribe austerity during the Depression while people starved still shape our debates about taxation and regulation and social welfare, how houses like this are not just history but prophecy, showing us what happens when wealth is allowed to concentrate without limit, when the comfort of a few is prioritized over the well-being of the many, when beauty becomes an excuse for brutality and art becomes a distraction from injustice and culture becomes a tool for legitimizing exploitation rather than questioning it. Staatsburg stands today not as a celebration but as a warning, its 79 rooms testament to both human creative achievement and human moral failure, its limestone facade gleaming above the Hudson like a beautiful gravestone marking the death of an era that should never be romanticized, should never be remembered as somehow better than our own time, should never be held up as an example of when America was great, because whatever greatness it represented was built on suffering that we can no longer ignore or excuse, and its very survival as a public historic site forces us to ask questions about our own moment. What are we building today that future generations will recognize as monuments to exploitation? What luxuries do we enjoy without considering their cost in human suffering? What systems of inequality do we perpetuate while telling ourselves stories about merit and achievement and how anyone can make it in America if they just work hard enough? Whose labor remains invisible so that our comfort can seem effortless, whose suffering finances our convenience, whose lives are shortened so that ours can be extended, whose freedom is constrained so that ours can expand? And perhaps most importantly, can we look at a house like Stottsburg and see it whole, not just its beauty, not just its brutality, but both at once, understanding that these are not contradictory truths but complementary ones, that the same society that produced Stanford White's architectural genius also produced 17-hour workdays for housemaids, that the same economic system that allowed Darius Mills to accumulate millions also ensured that miners died in darkness thousands of feet underground for $3 a day, that the same political philosophy that guided Ogden Mills's treasury policies also justified letting children go hungry rather than disturb the sanctity of the balanced budget and the gold standard, that this is not a story with villains and heroes but a story about systems and structures and choices, about a society that decided, over and over, in 1,000 large and small ways, through laws and customs and social arrangements that seemed natural but were actually constructed, that the grandeur of the Mills mansion mattered more than the lives of the people who built it and cleaned it and made it run, a society that valued beauty so highly it was willing to pay for it in blood and suffering and stolen lives, a society that created structures of inequality so deeply embedded that they persisted through depressions and wars and social movements, that adapted to new circumstances but never fundamentally changed, that we have inherited and that we must now decide whether to reproduce or transform, whether to celebrate or condemn, whether to honor or dismantle, and the Mills mansion stands on its bluff above the Hudson River, beautiful and terrible, monument and warning, achievement and crime, waiting for our answer, asking us whether we have the courage to see clearly and the will to act justly, or whether we will continue to admire the beauty while ignoring the blood that paid for it, continue to celebrate wealth while excusing exploitation, continue to preserve the houses while forgetting the humans, continue to tell ourselves comfortable lies about merit and achievement while the same systems that built Stottsburg continue to concentrate wealth and power in fewer and fewer hands, continue to sacrifice the many for the comfort of the few, continue to build beautiful monuments on foundations of suffering, and if we choose that path, if we learn nothing from Stottsburg except to admire its architecture and envy its owners, then perhaps we deserve the future we're creating, a future where our own achievements will be judged not by their beauty but by their cost, not by what we built but by who we destroyed to build it, not by the luxury we enjoyed but by the suffering we ignored, and perhaps someday someone will tour our houses and ask the same questions we now ask about the Mills mansion. What were they thinking? How could they not see? Why did they choose beauty over justice, comfort over compassion, wealth over human dignity? And perhaps they will struggle to understand us just as we struggle to understand the Millses, but at least they will have this house, this beautiful, terrible house, as evidence of what happens when a society loses its moral compass, when wealth becomes the only value and power the only goal, when the question is never whether we should build palaces while others starve but only how magnificent we can make those palaces and how thoroughly we can hide the starvation that makes them possible.